The air hung heavy and still, thick with the scent of damp earth and something acrid I couldn't quite place, a chemical tang mixed with stale regret. I stepped out of the vehicle, the crunch of gravel under my boots a stark counterpoint to the hushed reverence surrounding the scene. Ahead, a sprawling modern structure of glass and steel nestled incongruously among ancient gnarled oaks. Elias Thorne's retreat, they'd called it. Now it was just the site. My gaze swept over the scene. The perimeter was marked by yellow tape, a flimsy barrier against the world yet somehow absolute. Inside, a tableau. The tech titan Elias Thorne slumped in an expensive armchair, a vintage revolver clutched loosely in his hand. The room was meticulously tidy, almost staged. No overturned furniture, no struggle. Just a single dark stain blooming on the pristine white shirt, stark against the fabric. A note, handwritten, lay on a polished side table, weighted by a glass paperweight. Suicide, the initial report had screamed. But my gut, a seasoned veteran of countless digital autopsies, already whispered dissent. User C, glad I could make it. The voice was brisk, cutting through the quiet. The detective, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper jawline, approached. Her uniform was crisp, her expression unyielding. Detective Sharma, we've secured the scene. Standard procedure, but we're pretty confident this is an open and shut. I nodded, my eyes still scanning, absorbing every minute detail. Confident, detective, what makes I so sure? I kept my tone neutral, but a flicker of impatience crossed her features. She wanted this wrapped up, processed, filed away. I could feel it radiating off her. The note, the weapon, the lack of forced entry. His assistant reported him despondent lately. Financial pressures, a recent scandal with one of his company's data breaches. It all lines up. She rattled off a practiced recitation. She gestured vaguely towards Thorne. He was alone in the house. Locks were engaged from the inside. Nothing suggests otherwise. Nothing obvious suggests otherwise. I corrected gently, my gaze settling on Thorne's left hand. The revolver was positioned awkwardly, almost as if placed there after the fact. His fingers were splayed, not clenched in the rigid grip of a final, desperate act. It was a subtle thing, easily dismissed by someone looking for a quick resolution. But I wasn't someone looking for a quick resolution. I was looking for truth buried under layers of data. Right. Well, that's where I come in. Get what I need from his devices. We've got a colleague bagging the physical evidence, but the digital footprint, that's my domain. She gestured towards a small, secure room off the main living area. That's his office. Computers, phones, smart home hub, I name it. The office was a temple to technology. A sleek, minimalist laptop sat closed beside a high-end gaming rig. 2 smartphones, a tablet, and what looked like a custom-built server tower hummed softly in a corner rack. This was my world. This was where the real story lived. I pulled on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves, the material stretching taut over my fingers. My kit bag lay open on the floor, an organized chaos of cables, forensic drives, and specialized tools. I started with the most accessible, the 2 smartphones. One, a personal device, lay face down, its screen cracked like a spiderweb. The other, a corporate-tissued behemoth, was still powered on, displaying a lock screen. My fingers, trained to a surgeon's precision, worked methodically. I photographed the position of each device, documented its state, and carefully placed evidence tags. I powered down the corporate phone, using a Faraday bag to isolate it immediately. For the personal phone, the cracked screen presented a challenge, but not an insurmountable one. I'd deal with that back at base. Next, the laptop. I found it in sleep mode. Rather than powering it on, which could alter volatile data, I hooked up my forensic imager, a small, unassuming device that would create a bit-for-bit copy of the entire drive without booting the operating system. It was a slow process, but an essential one. Every pixel, every line of code, every timestamp was a potential clue. While the laptop drive began its agonizingly slow transfer, I turned my attention to the desktop tower. This was Thorne's main workstation, likely a treasure trove. I located the main drive, carefully disconnected it, and prepared it for imaging. The smart home hub, a small, unassuming black cylinder, was next. I unplugged it, noting the precise time, and bagged it. These systems, often overlooked, could record everything from door movements to voice commands, light schedules to network activity. A silent observer, always listening. As I worked, a small detail caught my eye. On the edge of the desk, tucked almost out of sight, was a small, high-end smartwatch. I picked it up, noting its cool metallic casing. Its charging cradle was empty, lying uselessly beside it. Why would a man known for being meticulously organized and always connected let his primary wearable run out of battery? And more importantly, why wasn't it on his wrist? I glanced back at Thorne's slumped figure in the armchair. His wrist was bare. No watch. No sign of one having fallen off. A flicker of unease, tiny as a moth's wing, brushed against my certainty. It was a minute detail, easily dismissed by the detective eager to close her case. But to me, it was a discordant note in an otherwise perfectly orchestrated suicide symphony. This wasn't adding up. The pristine scene, the conveniently placed note, the oddly held weapon, and now the missing smartwatch, powered down and abandoned. Each on its own was insignificant. Together, they formed a faint, unsettling hum beneath the surface of the detective's neat narrative. My skepticism solidified. I carefully bagged the smartwatch, adding it to the growing collection of Thorne's digital life. The laptop imager was still churning, a tiny progress bar inching forward. This was going to take time, far more time than the detective had allocated for her open-and-shut case. I had a feeling I'd be spending a lot of hours in the sterile confines of the mobile forensic unit at a remote location, peeling back the layers of Elias Thorne's final moments, looking for the truth that his silent devices held. And something told me it wouldn't be a simple truth. It rarely was. 2 smartphones, an e-reader, and a couple of external hard drives completed the digital arsenal. My gaze lingered on the closed laptop, its polished aluminum surface reflecting the overhead light like a dark mirror. This, I knew, would be the main event. "Anything I need me to bag?" the detective asked, her voice cutting through the stillness. He was watching me, her expression unreadable. "Just the laptop, the main desktop, and the 2 smartphones for now," I replied, already pulling on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves. My kit bag was slung over my shoulder, its weight familiar and comforting. "I'll image everything else on site, but these need to go with me." I motioned to a colleague, a junior officer who had been waiting patiently by the door. "Careful with these. Treat them like delicate glass sculptures." The transfer was efficient, almost silent. Each device was carefully placed into anti-static bags, then into padded, lockable cases. I performed a quick on-site capture of the network configuration and any visible wireless signals, a standard precaution to preserve the digital environment as it was found. The air in the office felt heavy, charged with unspoken questions. I tried to push down the nagging sense of wrongness, the feeling that this wasn't just a simple tragedy. It was a hunch, nothing more, but my hunches had a nasty habit of being right. Soon, I was back in the familiar, sterile confines of the mobile forensic unit at a remote location. The unit was a nondescript, reinforced trailer, kitted out with an array of monitors, specialized hardware, and enough secure storage to house a small data center. It was my sanctuary, my digital operating theater. The hum of the servers was a low, constant drone, a white noise that helped me focus. I started with the deceased's primary workstation, the sleek, minimalist laptop. Its power button remained untouched. My first priority was always to create a forensically sound image of the drive, a bit-for-bit copy that preserved every sector, every deleted file, every fragment of data. I connected my write blocker, ensuring no new data could accidentally be written to the original drive, then initiated the imaging process. The progress bar crept slowly across the screen, a digital heartbeat counting down the minutes until I could truly begin my work. While the laptop's drive was being cloned, I moved to the desktop tower. Its internal drive was a beast, a high-capacity solid-state drive that promised a wealth of information. The same meticulous process. Secure connection, write blocker, imaging. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing commands into the terminal, verifying checksums, ensuring the integrity of the copies. It was a dance I knew intimately, a methodical ritual designed to leave no stone unturned, no bite unexamined, hours blurred. Coffee mugs accumulated on my workbench. The outside world ceased to exist. I was immersed in the digital detritus of a life, sifting through files, logs, and metadata. The initial sweep of the laptop revealed a fairly typical usage pattern for a tech CEO: endless emails, presentation drafts, code repositories, encrypted communications. Nothing immediately screamed foul play. Just the digital footprint of a busy, successful individual. Then I started digging into the system logs, specifically focusing on network activity and file access times around the estimated time of death. The initial report from the responding officers placed the time of death sometime between 10:00 p.m. and midnight. I was looking for anything unusual within that window or, more importantly, after it. I filtered the logs, narrowing down the timestamps, my eyes scanning line after line of alphanumeric characters. Most activity ceased abruptly around 10:37 p.m. The last recorded user action was closing a secure chat application. Standard shutdown procedures followed, then silence. For a moment, I felt a familiar flicker of doubt. Maybe it really was just a suicide. Maybe I'm overthinking this. But then, a specific entry caught my eye. It was small, almost insignificant, buried amidst a flurry of routine background processes that occasionally pinged the network even when a machine was technically off but still connected to power. This wasn't a routine ping. At 1:17 a.m., nearly an hour and a half after the last recorded user activity, and well past the estimated time of death, there was an outbound connection. Not just a connection, but a successful SSH login, a secure shell connection initiated from this very laptop. It wasn't a local network connection. It was directed to an external IP address, one that resolved to a server hosted in a highly secure offshore data center known for its anonymous hosting services. My breath hitched. My fingers paused midair above the keyboard. I double-checked the timestamp, then the source and destination. My eyes traced the log entry again, then again. There was no ambiguity. An SSH client on this laptop had successfully authenticated and logged into a remote server at 1:17 a.m. No, this doesn't add up. A person who had taken their own life at 10:37 p.m. couldn't have initiated a secure remote login an hour and a half later. It wasn't an automated backup, not with SSH. This required credentials, an explicit command, a deliberate action. My mind raced. Could it be a remote access Trojan? Possible, but the log indicated a user-initiated SSH client, not a covert backdoor. Could the time be wrong? I checked the system clock synchronization logs. It was perfectly aligned with network time servers. No discrepancies. This wasn't just an anomaly, it was a screaming contradiction. It tore a gaping hole in the suicide narrative. Someone, or something, had accessed this laptop after the deceased was no longer capable of doing so. And they hadn't just accessed it, they had logged into a very specific, very secure server. I ran a quick query on the SSH client's activity logs for that session. The connection lasted only 3 minutes. During that brief window, a single small file, encrypted and compressed, had been uploaded. Its name was generic, a string of seemingly random characters designed to blend in. But its existence, its timestamp, its destination, it was a digital fingerprint left by an unseen hand. This wasn't a suicide. This was something else entirely, and that something else had left a digital trail. I picked up the secure satellite phone, dialing the detective's direct line. The call rang once, twice. Sharma, her voice was crisp, professional. "It's user SC," I said, my voice betraying none of the internal turmoil, just a steely resolve. "I've found something. I need to reclassify this case. Then, a slow, deliberate intake of breath. User C, are I sure? Absolutely, I affirmed, my gaze fixed on the glowing lines of the log. I have definitive proof of activity on the deceased's primary workstation well after the estimated time of death. A secure, outbound connection to an external server. Someone was using that laptop when he couldn't have been. The tension in the air inside the mobile forensic unit at a remote location thickened, palpable. I could almost hear the gears turning in her mind, the shift in her perspective. This wasn't just a technical detail. It was a seismic shift in a case that had already been closed. "I'll be there in 20, she said, her voice now edged with a new, sharper urgency. The line went dead. I leaned back, a grim satisfaction settling over me. The easy answers had just vanished. Now, the real hunt began, and I was ready. The receiver clicked, a hollow sound that echoed in the sterile quiet of the mobile forensic unit at a remote location. "I'll be there in 20, the detective had said, her voice tight, a promise of impending scrutiny. 20 minutes. Not much time when I was staring down a digital rabbit hole that seemed to deepen with every click. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, the faint hum of the server racks behind me a steady counterpoint to the racing thoughts in my head. This wasn't just about finding something. It was about finding something irrefutable. The initial suicide ruling had been neat, tidy, and utterly wrong. I felt it in my gut, a persistent knot that tightened the more I reviewed Thorne's digital ghost. The pressure wasn't just from the detective's imminent arrival, but from the weight of what I might uncover or what I might miss. I took a deep breath, pushing aside the apprehension. Doubt was a luxury I couldn't afford right now. My gaze swept across the array of monitors, each displaying a different facet of Thorne's digital life. I had already isolated the primary data sets, his home network logs, the firewall data from his personal server, and the more heavily encrypted corporate network traffic logs I'd managed to pull from his work devices. The sheer volume of data was daunting, a digital ocean of timestamps, IP addresses, and packet headers. I started with the home network, a more straightforward beast. Thorne had been meticulous, a creature of habit, and his network logs usually reflected that predictable patterns, routine access to streaming services, news sites, and his company's secure portals. But as I scrolled through the outbound connection records for the night of his death, my eyes snagged on an anomaly. A series of connections, small, almost imperceptible to an IP address that didn't belong to any known service Thorne used. It wasn't a corporate server, not a personal cloud, nothing. Just a string of numbers that felt foreign. I cross-referenced the timestamp. The connections initiated roughly an hour before the estimated time of death and continued sporadically for about 30 minutes. Not a single, sustained connection, but bursts, like someone was testing a channel, or perhaps transferring very small, fragmented packets of data. My brow furrowed. This was a deviation from Thorne's usual digital footprint, a ripple in his otherwise calm online presence. I flagged the IP and the associated timestamps, adding them to a growing list of suspicious data points. Next, I shifted to the firewall logs from his home server. Thorne, being the tech CEO he was, had a robust personal setup. He valued his privacy. That firewall should have been ironclad, and for the most part it was. No direct external intrusions, no brute force attempts. But then I noticed a series of outbound packets, again, small in size, directed towards the same anomalous IP address. These weren't initiated by Thorne's usual applications. They looked like system-level communications, almost as if something inside his network was reaching out, bypassing his higher-level applications. My stomach clenched. A backdoor, but why outbound and so subtly? If someone wanted to take control, they'd usually go for a more aggressive, persistent connection. This felt more like a whisper than a shout. I traced the source port of these outbound packets. It pointed to a system process, one that usually handled routine network maintenance. But the data payloads were encrypted, even for these tiny packets. extremely unusual for a standard system process. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes scanning the hexadecimal strings, searching for any pattern, any recognizable header. Nothing. It was a perfectly opaque digital wall. The system process itself seemed legitimate, a core part of the operating system, but it was behaving oddly. It was as if a legitimate tool had been repurposed, given a secret task. A tiny bead of sweat pricked my temple. This wasn't just an anomaly, it was a carefully concealed pathway. Someone had been communicating with Thorne's network without leaving the obvious fingerprints of a traditional hack. Or perhaps they were communicating through Thorne's network. Wait, that doesn't add up. I mumbled to myself, the words barely audible in the quiet space. If Thorne was the target, why would his own system be initiating these encrypted outbound connections? Unless he wasn't initiating them. Unless something else was. And if so, how did it get there? I felt a surge of adrenaline. I needed to dig deeper into the actual data being sent. I initiated a deep packet inspection on the captured outbound traffic, filtering for anything associated with that suspicious IP. It took a few agonizing minutes for the analysis to complete, the progress bar creeping across the screen. The air in the mobile forensic unit at a remote location felt thick, charged with anticipation. When the results finally populated, a single, tiny file appeared in the analysis window. It was tucked away, almost obscured by the noise of legitimate traffic, disguised as a fragment of a larger data stream. The file size was minuscule, barely a few kilobytes, and its name was a string of random characters, no discernible extension. But the analysis tool flagged it immediately. Encrypted. Highly encrypted, and the encryption algorithm wasn't standard. It looked proprietary, or at least custom implemented. My heart hammered a rhythm against my ribs. This was it. A hidden communication channel, a cryptic encrypted message. It wasn't just an intrusion, it was a conversation. And Thorne, the brilliant tech CEO, was either the sender, the receiver, or perhaps an unwilling intermediary. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. The suicide narrative had shattered completely. This wasn't a man who took his own life. This was a man caught in a web, his own digital fortress turned against him. I stared at the file, a tiny, silent testament to a hidden truth. My fingers were already flying across the keyboard, initiating a deep dive into the file's metadata, searching for any clue about its origin, its purpose, or the encryption key. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder now, counting down the seconds until the detective's arrival. I had found something, all right. Something that blew the case wide open, and I had a sinking feeling this was just the first layer of a very dangerous onion. The receiver's click still echoed in the sterile quiet of the mobile forensic unit at a remote location. 20 minutes. Not much time when I was staring down a digital rabbit hole, especially one this deep and twisted. The detective's voice had been tight, clipped, a promise of impending scrutiny that pressed down on me like a physical weight. I glanced at the countdown timer I'd set on a secondary monitor, 19 minutes and ticking. My fingers flew across the keyboard, a flurry of motion born of habit and a sudden, urgent need to validate what I was seeing. The anomalous network activity I'd flagged earlier wasn't just a blip. It was a carefully constructed digital facade, a series of proxies and anonymizers designed to obscure a trail. But I'd been doing this long enough to know that even the most meticulous architects of digital deceit often left a fingerprint, a unique signature in their methods. I started with the suspicious IP address, the initial point of contact that had allowed the intruder access to Thorne's network. Public databases, routing tables, historical DNS records, I threw everything I had at it, watching the lines of code scroll by, each one a potential breadcrumb. Most of the early hops were dead ends, generic hosting providers, virtual private networks registered in distant, uncooperative jurisdictions. It was like peeling an onion, layer after frustrating layer, each one seemingly identical to the last. My initial confidence wavered for a split second. Had I overstated the anomaly? Was this just sophisticated, run-of-the-mill hacking, not something tied to Thorne's death. No, the timing was too precise, the target too specific. I pushed the doubt aside. Then a flicker. A recurring pattern in the routing a particular autonomous system number, ASIN, that, while not directly linked to the final destination, appeared consistently in the obfuscation chain. It was subtle, easily missed by automated tools, but I'd seen it before. A specific digital fingerprint used by a particular kind of operator. I cross-referenced the ASN with known corporate networks and infrastructure providers. Nothing immediately jumped out, but a hunch, a gut feeling I'd learned to trust, told me I was on the right track. I pivoted to the domain name associated with the command and control server, the one that had been communicating with Thorne's devices. Whose records were predictably redacted, the registrar a shell company in a tax haven. Classic. But the history of the domain, the subtle changes in its name servers over time, the brief periods when it hadn't been so thoroughly anonymized, that's where the real story often lay hidden. And there it was. A 2-week window, roughly 6 months prior, when the domain's name servers had pointed directly to a specific set of servers hosted by a major data center. Not just any data center, but one known for its high-security infrastructure, and more importantly, one that was a primary hub for Apex Innovations, a direct, aggressive rival to Thorne's company. My breath hitched. Apex Innovations. They had been in a fierce bidding war with Thorne over a groundbreaking AI patent only a few months ago, a patent Thorne's company had ultimately secured. The competitive landscape in this industry was brutal, but this was beyond brutal. This was predatory. A jolt went through me, an electric current of grim satisfaction mixed with a growing unease. This wasn't just some random hacker. This was targeted, deliberate, and had the hallmarks of corporate espionage. The suicide narrative, which had felt off from the start, now shattered completely. Thorne hadn't just died, he'd been targeted. I dug deeper, now with a clear direction. If Apex Innovations was involved, what were they after? The AI patent was the obvious answer, but I needed proof. I turned my attention to Thorne's network logs from the days leading up to his death, specifically focusing on outbound data transfers. My fingers flew, parsing gigabytes of traffic data, filtering by size, destination, and encryption type. The mobile forensic unit at a remote location hummed around me, the only sound apart from the rhythmic click of the keyboard. The air felt thick, charged with the weight of the discovery. My eyes scanned the green text on the black screen, searching for anomalies, for the telltale signs of data leaving the network in bulk. A massive data transfer, several terabytes in total, initiated just 36 hours before Thorne was found. It wasn't a single continuous stream, but rather a series of segmented, encrypted packets, carefully disguised as routine backup traffic. But the destination wasn't Thorne's secure off-site storage. It was a temporary, ephemeral server cluster, also operating within the same data center identified earlier, though not directly within Apex Innovations' primary subnet. It was a digital dead drop designed to be spun up, used, and then wiped clean. I quickly analyzed the metadata of the exfiltrated files. Project code, design schematics, financial projections for the next quarter. And yes, several encrypted archives labeled Project Chimera, the internal code name for the AI patent Thorne had so fiercely protected. It was all there, laid bare. The crown jewels of Thorne's company, systematically plundered. The implication hit me with the force of a physical blow. Someone had stolen Thorne's most valuable assets, and then, shortly after, Thorne was dead. The connection was undeniable, stark, and terrifying. This wasn't just a theft. It felt like a cleanup operation. My mind raced. They was at Apex Innovations directly, through their own employees. Or was it a disgruntled former employee of Thorne's, perhaps one with deep knowledge of his company's infrastructure, who had then used Apex's resources or even sold the information to them? The temporary drop-off point suggested a degree of separation, a middleman, or a very cautious operator. It made the disgruntled former employee angle more plausible, a way for Apex to acquire the data without getting their hands directly dirty, at least not in a way that left an obvious trail. But the underlying network infrastructure still pointed to them. They were involved, one way or another. The timer on my screen flashed, 00:00:27, 27 seconds. I leaned back, my chair groaning softly. The digital rabbit hole had led me straight to a den of vipers. I had a suspect, or at least a highly motivated entity and a clear motive for foul play. But the deeper I went, the more dangerous this felt. Thorne's death wasn't a sad ending. It was a brutal punctuation mark at the end of a very long, very expensive sentence. The low rumble of an approaching vehicle reached my ears, growing louder, closer. Headlights swept across the frosted windows of the mobile forensic unit at a remote location. The detective was here. I stared at the screen, at the damning evidence of corporate theft and cold calculation, and wondered if he was ready for what I was about to tell her. Because this wasn't just a case of suicide anymore. This was murder, cloaked in ones and zeros. And I was standing right in the middle of it. The click of the receiver still felt like a physical echo in the confined space of the mobile forensic unit at a remote location. 20 minutes, the detective had said. 20 minutes until they arrived, bringing with them a scrutiny I wasn't entirely ready for, not when I was sitting on a digital powder keg. The air was thick with the hum of the servers, a constant, low thrumming that usually soothed me, but now it felt like a countdown. My eyes were glued to the primary monitor, the screen a kaleidoscope of hexadecimal code and progress bars. The encrypted file, the one buried deep within the CEO's private partition, was my current obsession. It was a stubborn beast, resisting every standard tool in my arsenal. I'd spent the last few hours throwing everything I had at it, custom-built scripts designed to exploit known vulnerabilities, brute force algorithms hammering away at the potential key space, even obscure dictionary attacks based on the deceased's known interests and project names. Each failed attempt was a tiny prick of frustration, but it only fueled my resolve. This file was screaming important, and I intended to listen. I leaned back, rubbing the bridge of my nose. My fingers flew across the keyboard, calling up a fresh set of parameters. I'd noticed a peculiar pattern in the file's metadata, a subtle anomaly in the timestamps that suggested a specific, older encryption standard, one rarely used in modern corporate environments. It was a long shot, a hunch born of countless hours spent sifting through digital detritus. If I was right, the key space would shrink dramatically. The mobile forensic unit at a remote location was a sanctuary, usually. Today, it felt like a pressure cooker. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the unit's efficient climate control. I initiated the new decryption sequence, watching the green progress bar crawl forward. It moved faster this time, significantly faster. My breath hitched. Could it be? Minutes bled into an eternity. The hum of the equipment intensified, or maybe it was just my perception. Then with a soft ping that cut through the silence, the status changed. Decryption complete. A wave of relief, potent and sweet, washed over me, quickly followed by a jolt of apprehension. I clicked the newly accessible file. It wasn't a single document, but an archive of communications, encrypted chat logs, internal memos, and what looked like highly sensitive project specifications. My gaze locked onto the dates, spanning the last 6 months, right up to the week before the CEO's death. The names weren't explicitly stated, but the context was damning. References to Project Chimera, the acquisition of proprietary neurointerface designs, and Thorne's market manipulation strategy. Thorne. The name reverberated in my mind. Thorne, the CEO's closest rival, the one who stood to gain most from their demise. Thorne, whose company was coincidentally about to launch a product uncannily similar to the deceased's rumored breakthrough. I scrolled through the logs, my eyes widening with each line. This wasn't just corporate espionage. This was a meticulously orchestrated campaign. Discussions about intellectual property theft, coordinated stock shorting, even thinly veiled threats against employees who might expose the operation. It painted a picture of a vast, predatory network systematically dismantling a competitor from the inside out. The sheer audacity of it, the scale. It was breathtakingly cynical. "Wait," I murmured aloud, the sound swallowed by the unit. "That doesn't add up." The official story was suicide, a brilliant mind, crumbling under pressure. But these communications, they spoke of a fight, a desperate attempt by the CEO to protect their work. They were a victim, not a capitulator. The digital footprint I'd been chasing had just opened into a chasm. This wasn't just about a single death. It was about a corporate war, and the CEO was merely the first casualty. A cold dread began to seep into my bones. If this was true, if Thorne was behind this, then the detective's initial ruling was either terribly misguided or deliberately steered. And I, User C, was now holding the smoking gun. Just as I was about to dive deeper, to connect the dots more firmly, the lights in the mobile forensic unit at a remote location flickered violently. My monitors went black for a terrifying second, then sputtered back to life, but something was wrong. My primary forensic workstation, the one displaying the decrypted files, was showing a cascade of error messages. Kernel panics, file corruption warnings, network intrusion alerts flashing in angry red. This wasn't a power surge. This wasn't a random glitch. It was too precise, too targeted. The other systems in the unit were stable, their lights glowing green. Only my workstation, the one accessing the sensitive data, was under attack. I frantically tried to save the decrypted logs, to copy them to an isolated drive, but the system was locking up, fighting against me. A progress bar appeared on the screen, not one of mine, but a malicious one, rapidly filling, indicating data deletion. My fingers flew, trying to wrest control back, but it was like wrestling a phantom. The system was compromised, and quickly. This wasn't just a warning. It was an attempt to erase my discovery and probably me along with it. They knew. Someone out there knew I was getting close, and they were coming for me. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the rising tide of fear. The 20 minutes were up, and I was no longer just an investigator. I was a target. A wave of relief, potent and sweet, washed over me, quickly followed by a jolt of apprehension. My gut clenched. This was it. The sterile hum of the servers in the mobile forensic unit at a remote location was the only sound breaking the silence, a constant, low thrum that had become the soundtrack to my life these past few days. I leaned closer to the monitor, the blue light reflecting in my glasses, and began to parse the data. The sheer volume was daunting. Thousands of lines of text, coded acronyms, timestamps that stretched back over a year. It was like trying to drink from a fire hose. I started with the chat logs, filtering for Thorne's user ID. His messages, once clipped and professional, grew increasingly terse, almost frantic, in the weeks leading up to his supposed suicide. He was communicating primarily with one other ID, an internal executive, judging by the corporate domain listed in the headers. Let's call them the executive. Their exchanges revolved around a project codenamed Aegis. The language was deliberately vague, couched in technical jargon that even I, with my background, had to cross-reference with the project specifications. The Aegis project wasn't just groundbreaking, it was world-altering. It detailed a proprietary, quantum-encrypted communication network designed to operate independently of all existing global infrastructure. Untraceable, unhackable, and capable of transmitting data at speeds that defied current scientific understanding. Thorne hadn't just been building a new app or a faster processor. He'd been constructing the digital equivalent of a nuclear deterrent, a system that could shift the balance of global power. No wonder someone wanted it, or him, gone. But what about the location? The previous chapter's geolocation data from Thorne's personal devices had been nagging at me. It showed unusual activity, strange pings at odd hours, not just from his sprawling estate or his office tower, but from a specific cluster of coordinates that I'd flagged as anomalous. Now, with the decrypted communications in front of me, I had a new lens. I opened a separate window and pulled up the geolocation logs again, overlaying them with a map. Then I cross-referenced the timestamps from the most urgent chat logs with Thorne's physical movements. My fingers flew across the keyboard, a rhythm born of countless hours of forensic work. The screen filled with lines and dots, a digital breadcrumb trail. The executive's messages often contained veiled references to the site or the old place. I searched the archive for any mention of physical addresses or distinguishing features. Bingo! A memo, dated 3 months prior, detailing a budget request for retrofitting abandoned industrial facility, Sector Gamma. Sector Gamma was a neglected industrial district on the outskirts of the city, known for its crumbling infrastructure and forgotten factories. I zoomed in on the map. The cluster of anomalous geolocation pings from Thorne's devices aligned almost perfectly with the coordinates of a specific abandoned factory in Sector Gamma. Not just any factory, but one that matched the budget request's vague description. A colossal, hulking structure of rusted steel and broken windows, a relic from a bygone era. It was far from any residential areas, perfect for clandestine meetings. My breath hitched. This wasn't just a digital footprint. It was a physical location, a secret rendezvous point. The executive, the Aegis project, and a secret meeting place. The pieces were starting to click together, forming a picture far more sinister than I'd initially imagined. Thorne wasn't just a victim of corporate espionage. He was at the center of a geopolitical earthquake. I scrolled through more of the executive's communications. There were frequent mentions of the asset and the handover. The Aegis project wasn't just being built, it was being sold, and not to a corporate partner. The language hinted at something far more clandestine, far more dangerous. My stomach twisted. The asset sounded less like a piece of technology and more like a person, or perhaps the entire system itself being delivered into the wrong hands. One particular chat log sent a shiver down my spine. It was a brief exchange between Thorne and the executive, just days before Thorne's death. Thorne, they're moving too fast. This isn't what we agreed. Executive, no time for cold feet, Thorne. The deal is set. Deliver. Thorne, deliver what? My life? This isn't right. We need to reconsider. Executive, there is no reconsidering. You built it. Now it's theirs. Theirs. The pronoun hung in the digital air, heavy with unspoken menace. It wasn't ours, it was theirs. And Thorne had felt his life was on the line. Suddenly, a new filter caught my eye. Among the internal memos, one stood out, originating not from Thorne's company, but from a secure government domain. It was an access log, documenting visits to the abandoned factory in Sector Gamma. The visitor, not the executive, but a high-ranking official from a national security agency, designated as the director. The dates of their visits coincided precisely with the most intense communication exchanges between Thorne and the executive, and with Thorne's own geolocation pings from the site. My mind raced. Thorne, his executive, an abandoned factory, a quantum communication network, and a national security director. This wasn't just corporate espionage. This was a deep state play, a conspiracy reaching into the highest echelons of power. Thorne hadn't been building a product. He'd been coerced into building a weapon, or at least a tool of unprecedented surveillance and control. I had suspected foul play, but this. Was I truly seeing what I thought I was seeing? Could it be that simple, yet so complex? For a fleeting moment, I questioned my own interpretation, the possibility that I was connecting dots that weren't meant to be connected, seeing ghosts in the machine. But the evidence, digital and geographic, was too stark, too undeniable. The pattern was too precise. This was an execution, orchestrated at a level I hadn't dared to imagine. And I, user C, was now holding the digital smoking gun. The very act of uncovering this truth made me a target. The quiet hum of the servers now sounded less like a benign backdrop and more like a low, predatory growl. I was no longer just investigating a death. I was uncovering a secret that powerful entities had killed to protect, and they wouldn't hesitate to do it again. The mobile forensic unit at a remote location hummed with the quiet thrum of a dozen machines, each churning through data, each a potential key. I leaned closer to the monitor, the last few words of the previous chapter echoing in my head. Secure govern me. My fingers flew across the keyboard, a fresh surge of adrenaline sharpening my focus. That government memo, it wasn't just a random document. It was a digital breadcrumb leading away from Thorne's corporate world and into something far more sprawling. I clicked on the filter, isolating the memo, trying to trace its origin point, its recipients, anything that could give me a name, an agency, a department. The file itself was heavily redacted, a digital sieve, but even the metadata held clues. I saw an internal routing number, a classification tag I recognized from my early days in cybersecurity before I branched out into forensics. It suggested a high-level clearance, not just standard government issue. This wasn't some low-level bureaucratic blip. This was something significant. I tried to cross-reference the routing number with an internal government database. I still had access to a legacy backdoor, a relic from a past project I'd never quite decommissioned. It was a gray area, ethically speaking, but Thorne's death had twisted my moral compass. I needed answers, and the official channels were proving to be a dead end, or worse, a trap. My fingers hovered over the enter key, a tremor of anticipation running through me. This could be it. The first solid link to the true perpetrators. I hit the key. The screen flickered. Instead of the usual login prompt, a stark red error message blared back at me. Access revoked. Unauthorized attempt detected. All activity logged. My breath hitched. My entire body went rigid. I stared at the words, disbelief warring with a cold dread that began to seep into my bones. Revoked. I hadn't used that access in months, maybe a year. Someone had been watching. Someone knew I was digging. They hadn't just cut me off. They'd logged my attempt. It was a digital slap across the face, a warning shot fired directly at my console. The silence in the mobile unit suddenly felt oppressive. The hum of the machine seemed to mock me, their ceaseless processing now just a reminder of my severed connection to the outside world. My official channels, my established methods were gone, just like that. I pushed back from the console, the swivel chair groaning softly in protest. This wasn't just about Thorne anymore, it was about me. They knew. They knew. My life, my livelihood, everything I had built was suddenly under siege. I moved with a newfound urgency, a frantic precision. There was no time to waste. I couldn't stay here. The mobile forensic unit at a remote location was compromised. It was a beacon, a target. I grabbed my personal rig, a custom-built, heavily encrypted laptop, tucked away in a Faraday-caged backpack, alongside a burner phone and a few essential tools. I'd always kept it ready, a break glass in case of emergency kit, never truly believing I'd need it for something this personal. I wiped my temporary workspace clean, leaving no trace of my presence beyond the standard forensic protocols. I powered down the unit's main servers, making sure all my recent activity was buried under layers of routine maintenance logs. It was a delaying tactic at best, but it bought me time. The remoteness of the location, once a comfort, now felt like a vulnerability. I slid into my nondescript sedan, starting the engine with a soft purr, and drove away without looking back. No goodbyes, no lingering glances, just a clean break. My new base of operations was an old, sparsely furnished apartment I kept for emergencies, a bolt hole acquired years ago, paid for in cash under a pseudonym. It was Spartan, secure, and most importantly, invisible. I set up my personal rig on the small, sturdy table, its glowing screen a stark contrast to the dim room. The problem, I realized, was deeper than just locked databases. The memo, even in its redacted form, held an encrypted signature, a digital watermark that screamed sophistication. It wasn't standard government encryption. It was something bespoke, layered, and designed to resist even state-level decryption efforts. This wasn't something I could brute force with my current setup, not without drawing too much attention, not without weeks, maybe months. Time I didn't have. I needed help, and not just any help. I needed the Phantom. The Phantom, real name unknown, was a legend in certain circles, a gray hat hacker, a digital ghost who could slip through firewalls like smoke. We'd crossed paths years ago on a particularly thorny corporate espionage case. I'd provided the evidence, they'd cracked the impossible encryption. It wasn't a friendship, not exactly. More of a mutual, grudging respect, laced with a healthy dose of distrust. The Phantom didn't do favors, they did puzzles. I powered on the burner phone, its cheap plastic casing feeling alien in my hand. I accessed an old, encrypted chat client, one we'd used only once before. My fingers hesitated over the contact name, Spectre. It felt like summoning a demon. User C, I typed, keeping it brief. Need a consult. Level beyond my pay grade. Pay negotiable. A few agonizing minutes later, a reply flickered back. User C, still digging up graves. Thought you'd retired to a beach somewhere. What's the puzzle? Not a grave, I typed. A black hole, government memo, unique encryption signature. Looks like a custom job, military grade, but with a twist. The twist is what I need you for. Military grade, interesting, my kind of fun, send the hash, no promises, and my fee isn't negotiable anymore. It's exorbitant. I sent the encrypted hash of the signature, along with a few lines of the redacted text. I knew the Phantom would recognize the pattern, the impossible complexity. Give me a few hours, the reply came. Maybe a day. This isn't a simple lock. This is a vault designed by someone who really didn't want anything getting out. The signature, it's not just custom, it's adaptive, self-modifying. If this is truly what I think it is, you're not just digging up a grave, User C. You're poking a sleeping dragon. My stomach tightened into a knot. An adaptive, self-modifying encryption signature. That wasn't just corporate espionage. That was a whole new level of sophisticated state-sponsored concealment. It was something far more powerful, far more dangerous, and it was now very much awake. And I had just poked it. My stomach tightened into a knot. The Elias Thorne had spoken of wasn't just a shadowy corporation. It was something far more powerful, something that had the resources to develop and deploy tools that could adapt and re-encrypt on the fly, making traditional forensic analysis a nightmare. I was hunched over my workstation, the only source of light in the dim interior of the mobile forensic unit at a remote location. The hum of the servers and the low thrum of the generator outside were the only sounds breaking the oppressive quiet. It was late, or early, depending on how I measured time when I was chasing ghosts in the digital ether. Hours had blurred since I'd first flagged the anomalous encryption on Thorne's main server image. Now I knew what I was looking for. The payload, the actual malicious code that this elaborate shell was designed to hide. Each subroutine I neutralized spawned another, slightly different challenge. The code was designed to be evasive, to morph its signature with every attempted decryption, a digital chameleon. But I wasn't just decrypting, I was observing. I let it adapt, documenting its changes, building a profile of its metamorphic behavior. It was a painstaking, frustrating ballet of reverse engineering. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a weak point emerged. A tiny window, a fractional pause in its self-modification cycle, exposed a core module. I pounced, freezing the process, isolating the segment. It was like catching a handful of mercury. This wasn't the whole package, not yet, but it was enough to start. I dumped the isolated module into a sandboxed environment, a digital petri dish designed to contain and analyze threats without risk to my own systems. The first pass revealed its basic architecture. Remote access capabilities, check. Data exfiltration routines, check. System persistence mechanisms, check. And naturally, robust data wiping protocols designed to erase tracks with surgical precision. All right, standard fare for a high-stakes data grab. I mumbled to the empty unit, running a hand through my hair. My initial thought was that this confirmed the corporate espionage angle, just with a more advanced toolkit. But something felt off. The sheer complexity of the encryption protecting this specific payload seemed overkill for simple data theft. It was like using a nuclear deterrent to guard a garden shed. I dug deeper, disassembling the code byte by byte, mapping its execution flow. That's when the unique coding signatures started to emerge. Every developer, every team leaves behind a distinct fingerprint in their code, a preferred library, an idiosyncratic way of handling errors, a specific comment style, or even just the structure of their loops. These weren't generic, off-the-shelf components. These were bespoke. There was a particular method of obfuscating API calls, a specific sequence for memory allocation that pinged a distant memory. And then there it was. Not a direct match, but a series of distinct stylistic choices, a confluence of techniques that pointed to a specific, highly elusive threat group. They weren't after money. They were after influence, control, and deniability. The hair on my arm stood on end. This wasn't just some disgruntled competitor or a rival tech giant. This was something far more organized, far more dangerous. The tension in the unit thickened, pressing down on me. I took a deep breath, pushing past the shiver of recognition. Knowing who might be behind it, or at least what kind of entity, didn't explain the why. Not fully. Data exfiltration, fine, but the adaptive encryption, the extreme stealth. For what? I continued to unravel the malware, pushing past the exfiltration modules, past the remote access backdoors. And that's when I hit the true core, the modules that didn't fit the data theft narrative. These weren't about taking information, they were about creating it. There were subroutines designed to simulate user interaction with uncanny realism. Not just keystrokes, but mouse movements, application launches, even specific file deletions. It wasn't about wiping the entire system. It was about selectively removing certain logs, selectively opening specific files, selectively initiating certain commands. This wasn't just a sophisticated remote access Trojan. This was a puppet master. It could open Thorne's browser, navigate to a specific website, type a message, and even execute a sequence of actions on a connected device like, say, a smart home assistant or a personal communication device. It could make it look like Thorne himself had done it. A wait, that doesn't add up moment hit me with the force of a physical blow. The initial police report, the suicide ruling, the supposed note, it all coalesced into a horrifying clarity. The malware's true function wasn't just to steal data or spy. It was designed to manipulate Thorne's devices to stage the suicide. It wasn't just about covering tracks. It was about laying false ones. It was about orchestrating the entire scene, making it appear as if Thorne had meticulously planned his own demise, right down to the digital footprint. The selective deletions, the specific browser history, the perfectly timed activation of certain applications, it wasn't Thorne's doing. It was the malware acting as his digital ghost. The implications were enormous. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths, employing state-of-the-art, custom-built tools, not just to kill Thorne, but to meticulously craft a narrative of suicide. This wasn't corporate espionage gone wrong. This was a premeditated digital assassination disguised as a personal tragedy, and it meant the stakes were infinitely higher than I had ever imagined. The theirs wasn't just powerful, they were utterly ruthless, and they were playing for keeps. The hum of the servers inside the mobile forensic unit at a remote location was a low, constant thrum against the metallic shell, a sound I'd come to associate with both progress and impending dread. My stomach remained a tight knot, just as it had been since I'd stared at the signature of that adaptive, self-modifying encryption. State-sponsored concealment. The words echoed in my head, a chilling counterpoint to the sterile efficiency of my workspace. I leaned back from the glowing monitors, rubbing the bridge of my nose. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the ghost of strong coffee I'd brewed hours ago. Every pixel on every screen was a breadcrumb, a digital whisper in a storm of noise. I had logs from the deceased CEO's private servers, decrypted communications from his secured devices, and the unique, mutating malware signatures I'd extracted from his network. Now, it was time to weave them all together, to see the tapestry of deceit for what it truly was. First, the logs. I pulled up the timeline of server access, cross-referencing it with the CEO's known schedule and the initial reports from the investigative unit. There were several late-night access points, all originating from a single, untraceable VPN tunnel. But what caught my eye weren't the successful logins. It was the unsuccessful ones. A flurry of failed attempts, just days before the CEO's death, all targeting a specific, obscure data repository, a vault of early-stage project designs for the company's groundbreaking quantum computing initiative. The timestamps aligned with a period when the CEO had been out of the country, supposedly vacationing. A small detail, easily overlooked, but it snagged at my brain. Why would someone try to access an obscure project vault when the CEO, the only one with direct access, was away? Unless they believed he was the one trying to access it, and they wanted to block him. Next, the communications. I had parsed through thousands of fragmented messages, some heavily encrypted, some deliberately corrupted. The key, as always, lay in the metadata. The patterns of communication, the frequency, the geographic markers. Thorne had provided some initial intel on individuals of interest: a rival tech magnate, a disgruntled former board member, a senator with deep ties to the industry. I plotted their known digital footprints against the communication network I'd painstakingly reconstructed. A few lines converged, but one particular pattern stood out like a beacon. A series of short, heavily obfuscated messages originating from a secure satellite uplink, routed through an old, decommissioned server farm in a neighboring country. The recipient, through a complex chain of relays, was consistently linked to the office of the Senator Thorne had mentioned. Not the senator's personal device, but a network node within his administrative staff's domain. That was a careful, calculated layer of plausible deniability. Then, the malware signatures. The adaptive encryption, the self-modifying code I'd first encountered, was a marvel of digital engineering. Its purpose wasn't just to hide data, but to evade detection. It had been designed to mimic benign system processes, to shift its own parameters just enough to slip past conventional antivirus scans. But I had isolated its core, its unique digital fingerprint. I ran that signature against a database of known state-sponsored malware families, a database not publicly accessible. The results sent a shiver down my spine. A near-perfect match to a signature associated with a clandestine intelligence operation, one rumored to be involved in industrial espionage on a global scale but never officially confirmed. This wasn't just corporate sabotage, this was something far more insidious, far-reaching. I pulled up the physical evidence reports. The initial ruling was suicide, an open and shut case. A note, a locked office, no forced entry. But the investigative unit's report had mentioned a peculiar detail, a small, almost imperceptible scuff mark on the CEO's expensive desk, near where his hand had supposedly rested. They dismissed it as incidental, perhaps from a dropped pen. But I zoomed in on the high-resolution images. It wasn't a scuff. It was a faint, shallow indentation, consistent with the edge of a specific, high-end portable encryption key, the kind the CEO was known to carry for his most sensitive data. If he'd been alone, preparing to end his life, why would his encryption key be forced against his desk with such pressure? It suggested a struggle, a moment of desperate resistance. The failed login attempts on the quantum project vault while the CEO was supposedly away. The secure communications linking to the senator's office. The state-sponsored malware. The physical mark of a struggle. It clicked into place with a sickening finality. The suicide was a staged assassination. The CEO wasn't trying to access his own vault. He was prevented from doing so. Someone knew he was about to expose something tied to the quantum computing initiative. And the adaptive encryption wasn't just to hide stolen data. It was to frame the CEO, to make it look like he was the one trying to steal or hide information, thereby justifying his suicide and discrediting any posthumous revelations. The mastermind, the architect of this intricate web, wasn't the senator himself, but the power behind him. The senator was a pawn, a high-level asset. Their motive wasn't just greed for money, but an insatiable hunger for ideological control to dictate the very flow of information, to shape reality through technological dominance. The Quantum Project, with its potential to revolutionize encryption and communication, was a threat to their established order, or perhaps a tool they sought to seize for themselves. My breath hitched. The pieces fit too perfectly. Could I be wrong? Is this too neat, too cinematic? I rechecked my methodology, reran the cross-references, looked for any anomaly, any outlier that could unravel my conclusion. But the data remained consistent, damning. Every thread pointed to the same horrifying truth. This wasn't just about clearing the CEO's name. This was about safeguarding the future of information itself. I looked at the array of screens, at the digital proof of a conspiracy that reached into the highest echelons of power. There was no going back, no turning away. They wouldn't stop. I closed my eyes, picturing the senator, the public face of the deception. Then the unseen hand guiding him. I had to expose them, to rip away their carefully crafted veil of legitimacy. But how? A direct confrontation was suicide. I needed a plan, a way to broadcast this truth to the world, to make it undeniable, unretractable. I needed to leverage the very network they sought to control against them. My fingers flew across the keyboard, opening a new, pristine document. The first line was a simple command, initiating a secure, distributed dead man switch protocol. I would compile everything: the logs, the communications, the malware analysis, the physical evidence correlations into an irrefutable package. Then I would prepare it for release, timed precisely, through channels they couldn't possibly shut down once activated. It would be my last card, my ultimate weapon, and it would put a target squarely on my back. The hum of the machines continued, a silent witness to my resolve. I was no longer just a digital forensics specialist. I was a harbinger, standing on the precipice of a war for truth, armed only with lines of code and the unyielding conviction that some secrets could not be allowed to remain buried. The fight was coming, and I intended to meet it head-on. My stomach remained a tight knot, just as it had been since I'd stared at the signature of that adaptive, self-learning algorithm, the true architect of the digital deception. It was all there, laid bare in the cold, hard data. The manipulation, the remote access, the carefully constructed digital ghost. Now, it was time to show the world. The laptop, my lifeline, was already secured in its padded sleeve, tucked into a nondescript messenger bag. This wasn't just about proving a suicide was faked. It was about tearing down a carefully constructed illusion, exposing the rot at the core of a tech empire. The plan was audacious, bordering on reckless. The company, Ascendant Tech, was holding its annual innovation showcase tonight, a glitzy affair unveiling their new flagship product. The company president, the very individual whose digital fingerprints were now all over the late CEO's devices, would be center stage, basking in the glow of manufactured success. That stage, that network, would be my platform. Stepping out of the unit, the cool night air bit at my exposed skin. The remote location, a disused industrial park, offered little in the way of cover, but plenty in the way of solitude. I got into the borrowed vehicle, its engine coughing to life, and drove towards the city's glittering skyline, towards the heart of the beast. The convention center was a beacon of light and noise, a stark contrast to the quiet solitude I'd just left. Valets in crisp uniforms scurried about, guiding luxury vehicles. A red carpet, thronged with camera crews and eager attendees, snaked towards the main entrance. I bypassed the main chaos, slipping in through a service entrance I'd scouted days prior, blending with catering staff and technicians. Inside, the main hall throbbed with a bass line of electronic music and the chatter of hundreds of voices. Flashing LEDs painted the cavernous space in shifting hues of blue and purple. At the far end, a massive holographic display pulsed with Ascendant Tech-S logo, awaiting the grand reveal. The company president, a man whose smile could charm birds from trees, was already working the room, a retinue of handlers and eager investors trailing in his wake. My gut twisted. My target was the media hub, tucked away behind the main stage. I navigated through the crowd, my eyes scanning, my senses heightened. Every brush of a shoulder felt like a potential threat. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. Stay calm, user C, one step at a time. I reached the double doors marked authorized personnel only and flashed my badge. A burly security guard, distracted by a flurry of activity backstage, barely glanced at it before waving me through. Adrenaline surged. I was in. The media hub was a controlled chaos of blinking lights, monitors, and frantic technicians. Cables snaked across the floor like digital vines. I spotted an unoccupied workstation, a direct feed to the main presentation network. This was it. I slid into the chair, my hands clammy but steady. My fingers flew across the keyboard, a practiced dance of keystrokes. I wasn't just uploading data. I was creating a live, interactive forensic presentation, pulling directly from the evidence I'd gathered. The ADAPT signature, the manipulated timestamps, the remote access logs, all of it would be displayed in real time, undeniable. A voice, sharp and icy, cut through the din. What do I think I read doing? I froze, my breath catching. The company president stood there, flanked by two hulking security personnel and the head of security, his face a mask of furious recognition. His charming smile was gone, replaced by a predatory sneer. I really are tenacious, aren't I, user C? I thought we'd made our message clear. My fingers never stopped moving. Loud and clear, I retorted, my voice steadier than I felt. But I don't scare that easily. Get away from that console. The head of security barked, taking a step forward. Too late, I said, a grim satisfaction spreading through me. I hit the final key. On the massive holographic display above the stage, the Ascendant Tech logo flickered, then dissolved. It was replaced by a stark black screen with white text, data integrity compromised. A gasp rippled through the crowd. The music died. All eyes turned to the stage, then to the screen. The company president lunged, but the head of security held his back. Stop it, user C. I don't know what I'm messing with. Oh, I know exactly what I'm messing with, I replied, turning to face them, my laptop now broadcasting its feed directly to the main display. I'm messing with a lie. The screen shifted, revealing a timeline. The late CEO's final moments, not as a suicide, but as a carefully orchestrated digital assassination. Logs of remote access from an unknown IP, then routed through Ascendant Tech-S own servers, manipulating biometric data, faking login attempts. The crowd murmured, confused, then agitated. This is a hack. The company president roared, pointing at me. A malicious attack, get her out of here. The security guard surged forward. I snatched my laptop, clutching it like a shield. That's the signature. The adaptive algorithm, the ADAPT responsible for creating the digital ghost that framed the late CEO. It wasn't a human hand typing those final messages. It was code. The screen zoomed in on a specific string of characters, a unique identifier for the ADAPT algorithm I'd found buried in the system logs. Then another reveal, the network activity of that ADAPT, tracing it back not to a rogue hacker but to a secure subnet within Ascendant Tech itself. A subnet only accessible by a select few. The company president's face went ashen. This is a fabrication, he stammered, his voice losing its composure. A smear campaign, is it? I challenged, sidestepping a lunging security guard. My fingers were a blur on the trackpad, pulling up a new window. Because this ADAPT didn't just fake a suicide. It also systematically siphoned off intellectual property, valuable trade secrets from the late CEO's personal research, right before his death, all funneled into a shell corporation preparing for a hostile takeover. The crowd gasped. Several journalists in the front row began furiously typing on their phones. And who controls that shell corporation? I continued, my voice gaining strength, projecting across the silent hall. The screen displayed a corporate registration document, highlighting the beneficial owner. The name on the document was none other than the company president's own. He stood frozen, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and panic. The head of security, now looking uncertain, halted his men. The carefully constructed facade had shattered. The company president was no longer the charming visionary. He was exposed, a thief and a murderer. A siren wailed in the distance, growing louder. Justice, it seemed, was finally knocking. The roar of the crowd, a cacophony of gasps and camera shutters, was still ringing in my ears. My own voice, amplified through the hall's speakers, had been surprisingly steady, even as my hands trembled just out of sight beneath the podium. The screen, now dark, had shown the name, the true beneficial owner of that shell corporation, stark and undeniable. Then came the pandemonium. Before I could even step away from the microphone, a flurry of activity erupted at the back of the hall. Uniformed officers who had been discreetly positioned moved swiftly. I watched, a strange mix of vindication and disbelief washing over me, as the corporate executive, the architect of this entire charade, the man who had ordered Elias Thorne's silencing, was escorted out, his face a mask of furious indignation. Other key figures, the security chief who had facilitated the digital intrusions, the legal counsel who had drafted the deceptive contracts, were also led away, their expressions ranging from stunned silence to simmering rage. The press swarmed, microphones thrust forward, questions fired like bullets. I was shielded by the detective and a couple of other officers, whisked through a back exit, the clamor fading into a dull thrum behind us. We didn't go far. My destination was the mobile forensic unit at a remote location, a nondescript, reinforced vehicle parked discreetly a few blocks away. It was my sanctuary, my war room for the past few weeks. Stepping inside, the familiar hum of servers and the faint scent of ozone were a comforting anchor in the swirling chaos of the outside world. "User C, you did it," the detective said, his voice quiet, tinged with a respect I hadn't heard before. He gestured towards a monitor displaying live news feeds. Every major network was running the story. The headlines screamed, "Tech conspiracy unraveled," "CEO murder," "Suicide cover-up exposed," "Corporate titan arrested." Social media was alight, a flood of outrage, disbelief, and a strange sort of collective relief. People were sharing clips of my presentation, dissecting every detail, the evidence I'd laid bare. My face, tired and serious, was plastered everywhere. I sank onto my swivel chair, the padded armrests a small comfort. Did what? I muttered, more to myself than to him. Exposed a murder, brought down a few powerful people. At what cost? The detective didn't press. He understood. The cost had been high, not just for Elias, but for everyone involved, including me. I had risked everything. My career, my reputation, even my life had dangled precariously on the thread of those digital breadcrumbs. My immediate task was clear: secure the remaining digital evidence. The presentation I'd just given had been a snapshot, a carefully curated selection of the most damning files. The full data sets, the comprehensive logs, the complete chain of custody, all of it needed to be formally packaged, verified, and handed over for judicial proceedings. This was the meticulous, unglamorous back-end work that followed the fireworks. I pulled up the primary server interface, my fingers moving automatically across the keyboard. The data from the press conference, including the live feed capture and the original source files, were already being mirrored to encrypted drives. I initiated a final integrity check, watching the progress bars crawl, each percentage point a tiny reaffirmation of the truth. "We'll need your full statement, of course," the detective said, leaning against a workbench, observing my methodical work. "Everything from when you first noticed the anomalies, your process, the threats." I nodded, a weariness settling deep into my bones. The threats. The anonymous emails, the subtle digital probing, the very real physical danger I'd found myself in. It felt like a lifetime ago that I had dismissed Elias Thorne's suicide as just another case. Now, I saw the ghost of his final days in every line of code, every encrypted message. The loss of Elias Thorne, a man I had only known through the digital remnants he left behind, weighed heavily. He had been brilliant, yes, but more than that, he had been courageous. He had fought, albeit silently, against a powerful current, leaving behind a trail for someone like me to follow, and I had. My gaze drifted to a small, framed photo I kept on my desk in the unit, a picture of my own family, a reminder of what waited outside this digital labyrinth. Had I been reckless? Had I pushed too far? The thought, though fleeting, pricked at my resolve. The world of corporate espionage was a viper's nest, and I, a specialist more comfortable with algorithms than adversaries, had waded right into its heart. User C. The detective's voice brought me back. "Are you all right?" I straightened, forcing a professional demeanor. "Just processing," I replied, my voice a little rougher than I intended. "It's a lot." He gave a sympathetic nod. "It is, but you exposed something truly monstrous. You saved others from falling into the same trap." I wanted to believe him. I did believe him intellectually, but the emotional landscape was more complex. The relief was there, yes, a profound sense of having completed a difficult, dangerous mission. The memory of the hidden camera in my apartment, the feeling of being watched, sent a shiver down my spine even now in the supposed safety of the unit. The integrity check finished, displaying a green verified message. I sighed, a long, drawn-out exhalation that seemed to carry weeks of accumulated tension. "Right," I said, pushing away from the desk. "Let's get this statement done." Then we locked down every last bite of evidence. No loose ends. The detective looked at me, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "No loose ends," he echoed, but his tone suggested we both knew that in a world this tangled, some threads always remained, waiting to snag the unwary. The arrests were a victory, a monumental one, but the echo of the conspiracy, the sheer audacity of it, still vibrated in the air. This wasn't just about justice. It was about the insidious power of deception, and how easily it could masquerade as truth. And I, User C, had just ripped off its mask. The hum of the servers was a constant, almost comforting drone in the cramped confines of the mobile forensic unit at a remote location. Outside, the world was a blur of muted greens and grays, a landscape that felt miles removed from the gleaming towers and whispered conspiracies of the city. I'd been here for days, the only occupant, meticulously constructing the final forensic report, a document that would serve as the definitive narrative of our investigation. Every recovered byte, every decrypted message, every anomalous timestamp, it all had to be laid out, irrefutable and stark. My fingers flew across the keyboard, a practiced dance of precision. The screen glowed with lines of code, hexadecimal values, and timestamps, each entry a testament to the digital breadcrumbs we'd followed. I was detailing the final, critical piece, the remote access exploit that had allowed the conspirators to mimic the CEO's online activity, creating a digital ghost that had signed off on his own supposed suicide. It wasn't just about recovering deleted files or identifying IP addresses. It was about understanding the methodology, the cunning behind the deception. I paused, leaning back in my swivel chair, the springs groaning in protest. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and stale coffee. My eyes traced the complex web of connections I'd mapped out. The tampered network logs, the cleverly masked VPNs, the subtle alterations to the CEO's personal device settings that had granted backdoor access. Each element on its own might have been dismissed as an oversight or a technical glitch, but together they painted a picture of deliberate, sophisticated malice. This case had been a stark reminder that data, while immutable, could also be exquisitely manipulated. It had forced me to look beyond the raw numbers, to search for the human intent hidden beneath layers of code. There were moments early on when the official narrative felt so overwhelmingly plausible, when the sheer volume of evidence pointing to suicide was almost suffocating. But that nagging feeling, that persistent whisper of "wait, that doesn't add up," had been my guide. I'd always prided myself on my objectivity, my unwavering faith in the digital truth. This time, though, the truth had needed a push, a human eye to discern the lies woven into its fabric. The last paragraph of the executive summary felt heavy under my fingertips. I detailed the involvement of the corporate executive, the mastermind whose ambition had twisted a brilliant mind into a weapon. I described the meticulous planning, the layers of digital proxies and burner devices, all designed to create a perfect crime. A rap on the unit's metal door startled me. The door hissed open, revealing Detective Sharma. He stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of fresh air and a sense of quiet authority that always seemed to precede him. He said, a slight nod of acknowledgement. "The report is ready, I presume." "Just finished," I replied, gesturing to the glowing screen. "Every detail, every anomaly, it's all there." He moved closer, his gaze sweeping over the console, then settling on me. "I've been out here a while. Loose ends," I answered, echoing his words from our last conversation. "Had to make sure every thread was accounted for, every knot tied." A small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "And are they?" I met his gaze, a flicker of understanding passing between us. "As much as they can be. The arrests were solid. The evidence is overwhelming. Justice, at least for the CEO, will be served." I paused, choosing my words carefully. But I both know that in a world this tangled, some threads always remain. The kind that aren't visible on a screen, the kind that speak to motive and power that goes deeper than one corporate executive. He nodded slowly, the smile fading into a more serious expression. "Indeed. The public will see a solved case, a clear narrative. We know better." He reached out, accepting the encrypted drive I offered him. "This report will be foundational. My work. It was exceptional, user C." The compliment, understated as it was, felt significant. We'd started this investigation as two disparate forces, a cop and a digital specialist, both skeptical of the other's methods. But the shared pursuit of truth had forged something akin to a bond, a professional respect that bordered on friendship. I had learned to trust his instincts. He, I hoped, had learned to trust my data. It was a team effort. I demurred, though I knew the bulk of the digital heavy lifting had fallen to me. My persistence, my belief that something was wrong even when the digital trail was obscured, that was crucial. And my ability to unearth what was hidden, he countered. Without that, we'd still be calling it a suicide. He took a deep breath, looking around the small, functional space. "I put myself in considerable danger, I know. The memory of the threats, the feeling of being watched. I'd walked a tightrope, balancing the need to expose the truth with the imperative to stay alive. It had been terrifying, exhilarating, and ultimately transformative. I'd learned a resilience I hadn't known I possessed, a fierce determination to see justice done, even when the odds felt insurmountable. "It comes with the territory sometimes," I responded, a slight shrug, but it didn't. Not usually. This case had been different. It had peeled back layers of my own complacency, revealing a core of grit I hadn't fully acknowledged. He gave a final, assessing look, then turned towards the door. "Get some rest, user C, I've earned it." As the door closed behind him, plunging the unit back into its humming solitude, I leaned forward, resting my forehead on the cool metal of the console. The case was closed, the report filed, conspirators apprehended. Yet the echo of the conspiracy, the vastness of the power it represented, lingered. It was a victory, yes, a monumental one. But the world was still a place where truth could be manufactured, where lives could be casually discarded, and where a digital footprint could be both a lifeline and a death sentence. I had exposed a truth, but the fight against deception felt far from over. I was changed by it, hardened perhaps, but also undeniably stronger. The echo of the corporate deceit, the quiet hum of the server racks, the faces of those who had thought themselves untouchable, it all reverberated in the hollow space behind my eyelids. I pushed away from the console, the coolness of the metal still imprinted on my skin. The door had closed, yes, but some doors, once opened, never truly shut again. Not in your mind, anyway. Weeks bled into months. The meticulous digital breadcrumbs I'd unearthed had led the enforcement officers directly to the heart of the operation. There were hushed arrests, stunned denials, and then the slow, grinding machinery of the legal system began to turn. I found myself in sterile, brightly lit rooms, not hunched over a keyboard but seated in a witness chair, my words laid bare for scrutiny. The trial itself was a blur of legal jargon and veiled accusations. The prosecutor, a sharp-witted individual with an uncanny ability to simplify the most complex digital concepts for a lay jury, was relentless. He took my carefully crafted reports, the timelines, the reconstructed data fragments, and wove them into an undeniable tapestry of guilt. I testified for days, explaining encryption protocols, metadata anomalies, the subtle digital fingerprints that had screamed foul play where others had only seen suicide. I watched the faces of the conspirators, the former executives who had tried to bury their crimes under layers of code and corporate power. Their initial arrogance had slowly curdled into something akin to despair. The defense counsel, a slick orator, tried every trick in the book. He attempted to paint my findings as circumstantial, my methods as speculative, even my character as overly zealous. He suggested I had an agenda, that my interpretations were colored by a desire to find a grand conspiracy where none existed. For a fleeting moment, a sliver of that old doubt, the kind that had haunted me at the beginning of this whole nightmare, tried to creep back in. Had I overstepped? Had I missed something crucial, something that would unravel everything? But then I remembered the dead CEO's final, desperate digital plea buried in that obscure log file. I remembered the meticulous cross-referencing, the verification, the double-checking that had been my mantra throughout the investigation. No, my work stood. It was solid. The verdict, when it finally came, felt less like a triumph and more like a heavy sigh of relief. Guilty on all counts. Justice, in its slow, deliberate way, had been served. The architect of the cover-up, the true puppeteer behind the corporate espionage, received a sentence that would ensure he wouldn't see the outside of a secure facility for a very long time. His co-conspirators, those who had aided and abetted, received varying but equally significant punishments. The tech world, for a brief period, paused, collectively holding its breath before exhaling and hopefully learning a harsh lesson about the true cost of unchecked ambition. I didn't celebrate, not in the way others did with toasts and handshakes. I just felt tired and acutely aware of the thin line between order and chaos. The tension hadn't fully dissipated. It had merely shifted, settling into a new understanding of the world. The systems I protected, the data I safeguarded, they were always under threat. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger, systemic vulnerability. Back in the mobile forensic unit at a remote location, the air still carried the faint, metallic scent of ozone and the hum of electronics. It was late, the world outside cloaked in the kind of silence that only deep countryside offered. The lead investigator, a grizzled veteran with a surprisingly gentle demeanor, had approached me after the verdict. He'd offered me a position on a newly formed task force, one dedicated to preemptively striking against digital threats, moving beyond reactive investigations. He called it proactive defense. It meant leaving the solitary hum of this unit, trading it for a team, for collaboration, for a more public, albeit still clandestine, role. It meant stepping out of my comfort zone, pushing the boundaries of what I knew, what I was good at. A part of me, the part that craved the quiet solitude of my console and the certainty of my own methods, balked. But another part, the part that had seen the devastating fallout of unchecked digital malice, felt a pull, a renewed purpose. This wasn't just about finding the truth anymore. It was about preventing the lies from taking root in the first place. I thought about the dead CEO, about his family, about the trust that had been so cruelly betrayed. This case had been more than just lines of code and corrupted data. It had been about human lives, about the integrity of information, about the very fabric of the digital society we were building. I had faced my own demons during this investigation: the isolation, the self-doubt, the fear of failing to see what was right in front of me. But I had pushed through. I had trusted my instincts, backed by meticulous evidence. I had grown. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. The lead investigator had sent over a preliminary brief for the new task force's first major assignment. He called it the Ghost in the Machine, a reference to an emerging network of highly sophisticated, untraceable digital extortionists. I opened the file. The screen flickered to life, displaying a complex web of encrypted nodes, anomalous traffic patterns, and a cryptic message left in a hidden corner of a compromised server. It was a puzzle, intricate and daunting, far more sprawling than anything I'd faced before. A smile, small and determined, touched my lips. The tension was still there, a familiar companion now, not a paralyzing fear. It was the tension of a challenge accepted, of a new frontier to explore. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the cryptic data, my mind already sifting through possibilities, patterns, vulnerabilities. The hum of the mobile forensic unit at a remote location was no longer solitary. It was a prelude. I had a new purpose, a new fight, and I was ready.